Well, the economic news going into Christmas is not good. I wish it was better. What we've heard this past week further confirms the government-induced cost of living crisis that is hitting family budgets hard. Out of control government spending, destructive energy policies, red tape and high taxes are destroying families' living standards and cruelling our kids' future. Despite what Anthony Albanese and his Treasurer Jim Chalmers tell us, our falling living standards have very little to do with global factors like the Ukraine war. The financial pain being experienced by mums and dads in the suburbs has everything to do with our government's squandering of Australia's rich endowment of natural resources and being hell-bent on restricting private sector growth. Take spending. Every economist knows nothing fuels inflation more than governments borrowing money to give people free stuff. It is like petrol on the dumpster fire. This makes Treasurer Jim Chalmers the chief arsonist. Last week, news broke that the federal government spending had hit a record 12.3% of nominal GDP in September. Now, when families are being slugged high interest rates because the Reserve Bank needs to bring inflation under control, why is federal government spending at a record high? Every voter should be asking this question. This is at a time where Commonwealth debt is on track to hit $1 trillion and state government debt right around the nation is out of control, particularly in Victoria and Queensland. Victoria in particular is a basket case of a state economically after 10 years of Daniel Andrews. Alarm bells about Australia's dire economic state were rung this week by the respected economist Dr. Chris Richardson of Deloitte Access Economics and by the consulting firm McKinsey. Deloitte reported, and I quote, Canberra will post a $33.5 billion fiscal deficit this year, some $5 billion more than Treasury forecasts only a few months ago. Forget what Jim Chalmers says about his back-to-back surpluses. He's blown the budget and there are deficits based on current spending levels projected for the next 10 years. NDIS spending, despite attempts to rein it in, is out of control, as is aged care spending. Both, of course, are worthy and needy areas of government support. But when the private sector and households are being taxed to death and businesses face so much red, green and black tape, our non-existent economic productivity means we can no longer pay for the generous welfare and even for the welfare that we actually need, that's basic welfare. With China conducting the biggest military build-up in history, our defence spending is pitiful and we are unable to mount a meaningful defence of our nation. The biggest handbrake on the economy is the so-called energy transition, which is mandating taxpayer-subsidised windmills and solar factories dispersed across the Australian landscape to replace cheap and reliable sources of electricity generation that are in centralised locations. Industry can't function on expensive electricity and more families in the suburbs than ever are defaulting on their power bills. Who would have ever thought we'd come to this? In resource-rich Australia, this is a failure of our politicians of monumental proportions. They lecture us on climate catastrophe while exporting coal we're not allowed to use for the benefit of our own people. It's nuts. Now, McKinsey says our federal and state governments are killing the golden goose of economic productivity, which has underpinned our prosperity in the past 30 years pre-pandemic. Bracket creep on middle income earners, some of the highest company tax rates in the world, and the energy transition and out of control government spending are the culprits. Our problems are the fault of governments who think they can keep bribing us with free stuff, which is paid for on the public's credit card. Johannes Leek's cartoon in last week's Australian says it all. Albanese and Chalmers promised to cut electricity bills by $275. Instead, our electricity bills have gone up by $1,000. Panicking, they shovelled out $300 rebates to try and help our electricity bills, but of course the costs are blown out way beyond this. This is like using your already maxed out credit card to pay off some of your already unaffordable power bill. Someone try and make it make sense. With an election looming, Albanese and Chalmers have no intention of putting forward policies to chart a way out of the economic mess they, and in fairness, the previous Morrison government over 9 years has created. Now, the Albanese government launched their re-election pitch recently with another debt-funded bribe, this time to young people by way of student debt write-off. And more petrol will be promised for the inflation dumpster fire, with a universal childcare policy mooted as a signature re-election pitch. This is the Stephen Miles Queensland Labor government all over again, giving out free stuff. They gave out 50-cent public transport and free lunches and all this sort of stuff, which is all wonderful, but when you're up to your eyeballs in debt, it's incredibly irresponsible. It's the same with the Albanese government. We all love free stuff, but no serious economist believes Australia can afford it. As citizens and voters, we have taken our eye off the ball as our politicians have spent up big, creating a massive debt bomb which will slowly detonate in the face of our kids. This is an act of bastardry known as intergenerational theft. For a generation whose political leaders have also made home ownership unaffordable for the first time in the post-war era, resentment will only build amongst our young people. Now, Family First, the political party I'm a part of, is rebuilding as a partisan political movement to challenge the unsustainable spending agendas of the major parties. Cutting power prices by prioritising affordable and reliable energy, getting budgets under control and making home ownership possible again are key economic priorities of our party. While 9 years of coalition government before Albanese was definitely part of the problem, there is no doubt the spending always gets worse under Labor, and that's what's happened in the last 2.5 years. But both sides of politics need a conscience on their shoulders in the Australian Senate, reminding them that government spending must be reined in, that young families need to be able to afford a house, and that the renewable rollout must be stopped before we all go broke. Well, as we head into the Christmas period, I want to reflect on the year that has passed and on how the message of the coming of Christ might give us hope as we head into 2025. To help me do this, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor David Flint, a prominent Australian. He's a monarchist, academic, writer, lawyer and a civil libertarian. He's also a fellow host here on ADH TV, hosting Save the Nation. Professor Flint, thanks so much for your time today. Let's start with a sneak peek at your Christmas reflections for The Spectator Australia magazine, which comes out this Thursday. You start your article asserting that Christmas recalls the fundamental and continuing importance of Australia's Judeo-Christian heritage. Why is it so important for us to recall this, particularly at this time of year?
Well, it's one of the fundamental pillars of Australia. It makes Australia, along with, for example, the rule of law. They are those pillars which came with the British at the time of settlement, and they have made Australia what it is and the successful country that it is. And without respecting those pillars and knowing them, we always run into the danger of going backwards, of doing an Argentina or Venezuela, which is quite possible.
Yes, you write very eloquently about the Christian campaign to abolish the slave trade, which was actually happening sort of at the time of Australia's settlement. So that's something you've really picked up on there. But you say that the abolition of slavery owes nothing to the dogmas of Marxism, and that such dogmas have only led to modern slavery. Why do you think that Marxism and its modern form of cultural Marxism is so hostile to Christianity and never produces freedom?
Well, it's completely empty of any belief in anything above man except the power of the state and the power of the party. And that is a mistake in itself. And it is completely unreal in its doctrines. And these doctrines, which it believes depends upon the man being an angel, and of course man is not an angel, and once those powers are given to the state, essentially, absolute powers are given to the state and the party, they will be necessarily abused. That is why we believe in checks and balances, because we know that man is not an angel, that man will commit offences, that if man is given power beyond that which he should not have, he will abuse that power. That will be inevitable. And that really comes from the fall, that is to say that man is not perfect.
Yeah, I'm interested that you are referring to angels. This is the right time of year to be doing so, of course. For those who know the Christmas story, the angels came and announced the birth of Christ to the shepherds. But this year we've seen our politicians here in Australia trying to take on more and more power as if that they were angels. And I can think of the disinformation bill that Anthony Albanese tried to get through the Parliament. That was a near miss for us as a nation, wasn't it?
Oh, it was, and it goes against all of our learning. The whole great achievement of the Anglo-Saxon civilization is the realization that man is not perfect, and that when you're dealing with political power, the way to deal with this is to have a separation of powers, and without that separation of powers, you're tempting a dictatorship.
So this is why the Christmas story, I guess, is so important, whether people believe in the divinity of the Christ. And you say that probably most people in Australia who accept Christian teaching perhaps don't believe in the divinity of Christ. But of course, the Christmas story seems to indicate, or true believers believe, that this is when the divine Christ as God came to earth in the form of a child, announced by angels, all because we as humans are not angels. Is it possible for us to have that affection for and adherence to the teachings of Christianity that preserve us from the sort of tyranny that we see around the world and even encroaching here in Australia? Is it possible for us to protect against that tyranny, even if we don't believe in the literal story of Christ, as perhaps evangelical Christians might? If we don't accept the divinity but just accept the story, is that enough for us to safeguard ourselves?
I think it is enough, provided that there is within society a core of people who understand that Christianity is not just a story about a good man, which would be the position, I would think, of the majority. The majority would think, once they thought about it in any depth, that Jesus was a very good man, but he wasn't the Son of God, and that the resurrection did not occur. I think that would be the position. There would be in England, should imagine, many Anglican bishops who would take that position. For example, I think once you went to the evangelical churches, you would find a different position, that you would find a literal belief in these matters. And I'm not sure about the Catholic Church. I'm sure there would be many people in the College of Cardinals who don't really believe in the divinity of Christ or in the resurrection. But you do need that to give Christianity strength. The Judeo-Christian institution, that belief system that we have, is really the peak of human belief, because that can be demonstrated in its achievement. Now, for example, slavery, which we would probably all now accept is wrong to treat man in that way. You can't have people being subordinated and belonging to other people. But this was a normal institution of society in its many forms, slavery or serfdom or what have you. And this was an accepted form of a human institution and completely accepted by all civilizations. And it was accepted by the British, it was accepted by all the Europeans. The fingers are pointed at the British, but it's something which was universal throughout the world. And it was only a small group of believers, evangelicals, Quakers, the sort of people who, rather than being in the Church of England, would have become Methodists in later times. They believed and they campaigned strongly. The extraordinary thing was that their campaign, based on the belief that it was completely improper to treat man in this way as a piece of property, it was extraordinary that they were able to persuade the Parliament of the dominant power not only to abolish the slave trade, but then to move against the institution of slavery and to use the executive power of the greatest country in the world, the strongest country in the world, the Royal Navy, to use that to campaign against the trade over a number of years. This was an extraordinary development. Never happened before. No country ever came close to it. I think there was a nominal abolition of slavery during the French Revolution, but it was a piece of paper. It had no meaning and was immediately restored by Napoleon. You can only have this sort of situation, I think it's demonstrated by the abolition of slavery, through the strength of people interpreting the Christian religion and saying, Christ would not have accepted this, Christ would have taught against this. Now, slavery did exist at the time of Christ. It was a normal institution in the Roman world because they didn't have the same slave trade. They didn't have the enormities of a single trade as occurred when the British owned the American colonies and other powers owned American colonies. The extraordinary thing was the achievement, the persuasion of a great power to change its ways. And I think that went back to a core of believers, strong believers, firstly in the divinity of Christ and then in the teachings of Christ. And
are you concerned then that as we've gone away from that belief, and it's hard to say whether Australia has a strong core of people who still hold to the divinity and the resurrection of Christ and the miraculous aspects of it. It's certainly a diminishing number, but where does that leave our nation if that cohort of people is shrinking? And also, secondly, if the general population, young people today, are not being taught the stories of our Christian heritage and not even understanding the basics of the Gospels and even the Christmas story, where does that leave us as a nation?
Well, that leaves us in a perilous position, I think, because at least as formal religion was weakening, and it was certainly beginning when I was a youngster, and people younger than me would say, well, it wasn't in existence in the education systems of their day. And that, I think, weakens society so much. I put forward I think Chesterton is quoted in this regard. He didn't actually say it, but the quote attributed to him is, I think, very important. And that is that when man stops believing in God, it's not that he believes in nothing. He will believe in anything. Yeah. And we see the living example of that today. When people, for example, say they can't say what is a woman. Yeah. It's impossible now to say what is a woman. And they accept ridiculous ideas about the freedom we have to choose our gender. Notice they don't use the word sex. They disguise sex as gender, and they mean the same thing. And they say that you can change your sex at will. We have ridiculous doctrines like that. We have doctrines concerning race, for example, that if you are white, you're bad, and if you're not white, you're good, and therefore we must campaign against those who are white. And we have a society in which we've become obsessed. I was reading a piece by John Howard. It was a repeat of something he'd written before, and he was saying, when it comes to climate and the climate religion, he says, I used to be an agnostic. I think I'm moving more towards becoming a climate atheist. Now, climate has become a religion. Climate catastrophism is an essential part. It's the core dogma of that religion, and that has to guide your life. It has to guide the ways of government in relation to the way they run a country. So we see the madness which is occurring in Australia, where money is being poured down the drain in this pursuit of net zero, which is a pointless exercise because it will never be achieved because no country can be run that way. And we see the contrast in the United States.
So the importance of all this, I agree with you. The importance of all this is, going back to your article, is we need to have people who believe in the Christmas story, that God came to earth in the form of a child, that he was divine, and that we need a critical mass of people believing that, and hopefully that's spilling out into the rest of the culture. Just finally, before we go, Professor Flint, I know you're a fan of Donald Trump. He wouldn't consider himself a Christian, but he certainly courted the Christian vote in America. He's got Elon Musk on board and Robert Kennedy Jr. Now, all of these three men, again, not what we'd consider evangelical or fundamentalist Christians by any shape or measure, but they have all expressed the importance of the teachings of Jesus Christ and are seeking to try and get America back on a Judeo-Christian footing. That's significant, isn't it, in the sense that these guys are pushing back on the woke agenda like no one else in the world at the moment?
I think Mr. Trump would regard himself as a Christian. I think he would see himself as I'm not sure what religion he belongs to. Is he an Episcopalian?
He may be. I think a lot of my evangelical friends would perhaps, whilst they would welcome him as a fellow traveller, would probably see him as someone who perhaps wouldn't be a committed Christian necessarily, perhaps a cultural Christian.
Yes, I think that that description, cultural Christian, would be reasonably accurate. But I would say that many of the Christians of my day would have regarded themselves, once it were examined deeply, they would have regarded themselves too as cultural Christians. It was the norm. It was what you were. Something like 90% of the population when I was a young man would have been, or they would have regarded themselves from the point of view of the census as Christians of some denomination. In fact, they wouldn't have thought of themselves so much as Christians, but Church of England, as it used to be called, or Methodist or Presbyterian and so on.
Or Catholic, lots of Catholics in Australia. Professor Flint, do you, just as we wrap up and as we head into 2025, I have to ask you your tip for an election which might be sooner in the year rather than later.
I think there's a very good chance for the Liberals to succeed. There's no guarantee because they've got to overcome the prejudice of most of the media. Most of the media gave Mr. Albanese a very long, a record honeymoon. They completely ignores his weaknesses. They're coming now to accept that there are some weaknesses. They were strongly prejudiced against the leader of the opposition. They regarded him for some time as unelectable. They just decided he was unelectable, as they do these things. And I think there will still be that tendency to say, well, Mr. Albanese, he's a good bloke. He's a nice man. We should probably give him another chance. I think there will be a strong push along those lines. The problem is, of course, most of the people don't get their news from the Australian or from other newspapers. Most of the news comes from television, to the extent that people are getting their news today, because even watching the television news has been reduced significantly. So whatever way people are getting information, I don't think they're going to get much fair and balanced criticism of the activities of the federal government and a comparison with the opposition. Now, one of the weaknesses of the opposition is that they're still attached to some nominal form of climate belief. What is going to change a lot of this is the advent of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump realizes that climate catastrophism it's a fraud, it's a rort, it's something not to be accepted, and it will hold back the United States, and he will have nothing to do with it. And I think that will change things very much.
I certainly hope so, and let's hope that's the case as we head into 2025, and that our leaders here take some encouragement from that. Professor Flint, an absolute delight to speak with you today. Thanks for writing that brilliant article in The Spectator about Christmas and understanding the pillars of our civilization and how that comes through the Christmas story and what it's achieved politically and for human rights. And let's hope that more and more of our fellow Australians discover that as our nation moves into the new year. And I wish you a Merry and a Holy Christmas.